Qur'an chapter 70, Surah Al-Ma'arij by Sayyid Qutb, translation by Muhammad Al-Amrani. In the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful. A questioner asks about a punishment bound to befall, for the deniers of which there is no repelling force. It comes from God, the sustainer of the ascending steps, by which the angels and the Spirit ascend unto him in a day the span of which is 50,000 years. So endure with gracious patience. Indeed, they see it the punishment as far off, but we see it as near, on the day when the sky will be like molten brass, and the mountains will be like tufts of wool, and no close friend will ask after his friend, though they shall be made to see one another. The guilty one will desire to ransom himself from the torment of that day, even by giving up his children, and his wife, and his brother, and his nearest kin who sheltered him, and all that is on earth, if only that might save him. But no, it shall be a blazing flame, stripping away the skin of the head and limbs, calling to him who turned his back and fled from truth, and hoarded wealth and withheld it. Verily, man is created restless, when evil touches him, full of panic, and when good touches him, withholding from others, except for those who pray, those who are constant in their prayers, and those in whose wealth there is a known right for the beggar and the deprived, and those who affirm the truth of the day of judgment, and those who are fearful of the punishment of their sustainer. For indeed the punishment of their sustainer is not something to feel secure from, and those who guard their private parts, except with their spouses or those whom their right hands possess, for then they are free from blame. But whosoever seeks beyond that, such are the transgressors. And those who are faithful to their trusts and covenants, and those who stand firm in their testimonies, and those who guard their prayers, such will dwell in gardens of honor. But what is the matter with those who disbelieve, that they hasten before you with necks outstretched from the right and from the left in groups? Does every man among them hope to enter the garden of bliss? No. Verily, we have created them from that which they know. So I swear by the sustainer of all the points of sunrise and sunset that we are surely able to replace them with others better than them, and we shall not be outstripped. So leave them to delve in falsehood and play until they meet their day which they have been promised. The day when they will come forth from their graves in haste, as if rushing towards an altar, with their eyes cast down, covered in ignominy. That is the day which they were promised. This surah is part of the continuous, slow, deep and precise treatment of the lingering effects of ignorance, the jahiliyyah, on the human soul, as the Qur'an faced them in Mecca, and as it may face them in any other age of jahiliyyah, with only superficial differences, not in essence but in appearance. It is one of the rounds in the long and arduous battle that the Qur'an waged within the soul's depths, across its intricate paths, its hidden corners, and its accumulated debris. This internal battle is far greater and longer lasting than the military conflicts the Muslims would later engage in. These inner residues and remnants of jahiliyyah are far more challenging than any external forces that opposed the Islamic call and continue to oppose it in both ancient and modern times. The primary truth that this surah seeks to establish is the reality of the hereafter, with particular emphasis on the punishment awaiting the disbelievers as promised to them in the Qur'an. Along its way to affirming this truth, the surah touches upon the nature of the human soul in times of hardship and ease, a nature that differs profoundly when it is filled with faith and when it is devoid of it. The surah also highlights the characteristics of the believing soul, its feelings, its behavior, and its worthiness of being honored. In contrast, it gives a vivid picture of the disbelievers' worthlessness to God and the humiliation prepared for them, which befits their arrogance. The surah also underscores the difference between God's measures and human measures, and between divine standards and human ones. In doing so, it adds another link to the chain of long-term treatment of the lingering effects and misconceptions of jahiliyyah, or another round in the exhausting battle within the human soul across its twists and turns. This is the battle that the Qur'an fought and eventually won, armed with nothing but its own intrinsic power. The Qur'an's true victory was in the human soul, first and foremost, long before it had a sword to repel persecution or to compel its enemies to surrender. Anyone who reads this Qur'an while keeping the events of the Prophet's life in mind, feels the overwhelming force and sovereign authority with which it addressed the souls in Mecca, taming them until they willingly submitted. One senses how the Qur'an faced those souls with an astonishing variety of approaches, sometimes like a sweeping flood of suggestive signs and overwhelming influences, at other times like a crushing force that obliterates everything deeply entrenched in the soul's being. At times it confronted them with scorching lashes too painful to bear, while at other times it whispered to them in loving intimacy and tender companionship, to which hearts yearn and with which souls find comfort. In moments it frightened them with terrifying scenes and shocking cries that opened their eyes to the imminent danger. At other times it presented the truth with simplicity and clarity, leaving no room for turning away or disputing it. And at times it filled them with radiant hope and fresh optimism, calling out to them and gently inviting them. At other times the Quran would penetrate the soul's hidden pathways, casting light on its inner workings so that the person could see what was happening inside them with crystal clarity, prompting feelings of shame or disgust at certain aspects, while awakening them to movements and impulses they had been heedless of. Hundreds of subtle touches, calls, and powerful influences sweep over the reader of the Quran as they follow this long struggle and slow treatment, witnessing how the Quran triumphed over the stubborn, defiant Jahiliyyah within those souls. This surah reveals one aspect of that effort to establish belief in the hereafter and the other truths that it touches upon along the way. The reality of the hereafter is the same one that was addressed in Surah Al-Haqqah, but this surah approaches the topic in a different manner, presenting it from a new angle, with fresh images and shades of meaning. In Surah Al-Haqqah, the focus was on portraying the terror and dread of that day, expressed through violent upheavals in the scenes of the cosmos. Then, when the trumpet is blown with a single blast, and the earth and mountains are lifted and crushed with a single blow. On that day, the event will come to pass, and the sky will split open, for it will be frail that day. The magnificence and awe of that scene was further intensified by the presence of the angels surrounding the throne. And the angels will be on its borders, and the throne of your sustainer will be borne above them by 8 of them. The sheer unveiling of that day was so overwhelming that it would shake even the strongest souls. That day you will be exposed, and not a single secret of yours will remain hidden. The horror and dread were also depicted in the scenes of punishment, even in the pronouncement of the judgment itself. Seize him and shackle him, then burn him in hellfire, then bind him in a chain 70 cubits long. The cries and anguished regrets of those being punished further intensified the terrifying atmosphere. Oh, would that I had never been given my record and had never known what my account was. Oh, would that it had been the end of me. But here in Surah Al-Ma'arij, the terror is portrayed through the features, characteristics, and inner turmoil of the souls rather than through the movements of the cosmos. Even the cosmic scenes seem to evoke more psychological horror than physical. The most striking aspect of the day is not the external events themselves, but the internal soul-shaking realization of the impending disaster. On the day the sky will be like molten brass, and the mountains will be like tufts of wool, and no close friend will ask after a close friend, though they shall see each other. The guilty one will wish to ransom himself from the punishment of that day, even by giving up his children and his wife and his brother and his nearest kin who sheltered him and all that is on earth, if only that might save him. Here, hell becomes almost a living being, with awareness and emotions participating in the horror of the day. But no, it is a blazing flame, stripping away the skin of the head and limbs, calling to him who turned his back and fled, and hoarded wealth and withheld it. Even the punishment takes on a more psychological dimension than a purely physical one. The day they will come forth from their graves in haste, as if rushing towards an altar, with their eyes cast down, covered in ignominy. That is the day which they were promised. Thus the scenes, images and shadows of that day in Surah Al-Ma'arij differ from those in Surah Al-Haqqah, reflecting the distinct tone and style of each surah, even though the central truth they both convey remains the same. Consequently, Surah Al-Ma'arij takes up the portrayal of the human soul in moments of hardship and ease, in both states of faith and the absence of faith. This fits perfectly with the surah's psychological tone, as it describes the nature of man. Verily, man is created restless, when evil touches him, full of panic, and when good touches him, withholding from others. Except for those who pray, those who are constant in their prayers. The passage continues, painting a picture of the qualities of believing souls, their outward and inward traits, in harmony with the essence and style of the surah. Except for those who pray, those who are constant in their prayers, and those in whose wealth there is a known right for the beggar and the deprived, and those who affirm the truth of the day of judgment, and those who are fearful of the punishment of their sustainer. For indeed the punishment of their sustainer is not something to feel secure from. The main thrust of Surat al-Haqqah was to affirm the serious and unyielding nature of faith. Thus the reality of the hereafter was presented alongside other truths, such as the severe punishment awaiting the deniers in this world and the uncompromising treatment of those who alter the faith. In contrast, Surat Al-Ma'arij focuses primarily on affirming the reality of the hereafter and the scales of judgment that will be used in it. Everything else in the surah is directly connected to this central truth. For instance, the surah discusses the difference between God's reckoning and human reckoning, and between God's estimation of the day of judgment and humanity's estimation of it. The angels and the Spirit ascend unto him in a day the span of which is 50,000 years. So endure with gracious patience. Indeed, they see it as far off, but we see it as near. This is directly tied to the day of judgment. The surah also speaks of the difference between the human soul in times of hardship and ease, in states of faith and lack of faith, both of which are qualities subject to judgment on the day of judgment. Likewise, the surah addresses the arrogance of the disbelievers and their vain hope that they will all enter the gardens of bliss, even though they are worthless to God and incapable of escaping his punishment. This is closely related to the surah's central theme. Thus, the surah nearly exclusively revolves around the reality of the hereafter, the great truth it seeks to firmly establish in the hearts and minds of its audience, while touching upon other truths that are tied to its main subject. Another notable feature of this surah is its musical rhythm, which arises from its expressive structure. In Surat Al-Haqqah, the rhythmic variation stemmed from the alternating rhyme at the end of each verse, depending on the meaning and atmosphere of the passage. But here, in Surat Al-Ma'arij, the variation is broader, encompassing the entire rhythmic sentence, not just the rhyme. The musical phrase here is deeper, wider, and more complex. This variation is particularly noticeable in the first half of the surah. For instance, in the opening, there are 3 distinct musical phrases, though they share a common ending in their rhyme, in terms of length and internal rhythms, as follows. A questioner asks about a punishment bound to befall 1. For the deniers, of which there is no repelling force. 2. It comes from God, the sustainer of the ascending steps. 3. By which the angels and the Spirit ascend unto him, in a day the span of which is 50,000 years. 4. So endure with gracious patience. 5. The rhythm ends with the elongated A sound in the 5th verse. Indeed, they see it the punishment as far off. 6. But we see it as near. 7. Here the elongated A sound repeats twice. On the day when the sky will be like molten brass. 8. And the mountains will be like tufts of wool. 9. And no close friend will ask after his friend. 10. The rhythm ends with the elongated A sound in the 3rd verse, though there is internal rhythmic variation. They shall be made to see one another. The guilty one will desire to ransom himself from the torment of that day, even by giving up his children, 11, and his wife and his brother, 12, and his nearest kin who sheltered him, 13, and all that is on earth, if only that might save him, 14. But no, it shall be a blazing flame, 15. The rhythm ends with the elongated A sound in the 5th verse, similar to the first. stripping away the skin of the head and limbs, 16, calling to him who turned his back and fled from truth, 17, and hoarded wealth and withheld it, 18. Verily, man is created restless, 19, when evil touches him, full of panic, 20, and when good touches him, withholding from others, 21. Here the elongated A sound repeats 5 times, with 2 at the end that differ from the first 3. Then the rhythm settles in the rest of the surah with a rhyme on M and N, preceded by a war or ya. The rhythmic variation in the beginning of the surah is deep and highly intricate in its musical composition, drawing the listener's ear to the remarkable beauty of this complex and refined musical variation, one that is unusual in the Arab environment and in Arabic musical rhythm. Yet the Quranic style moulds it, grants it ease, and enables it to enter the Arab ear, which gladly accepts it, even though it is a profoundly creative art form, radically new to the musical norms of that time. Now, let us examine the surah in detail. A questioner asks about a punishment bound to befall. For the deniers, of which there is no repelling force, it comes from God, the sustainer of the ascending steps, by which the angels and the Spirit ascend unto him in a day the span of which is 50,000 years. So endure with gracious patience. Indeed, they see it, the punishment, as far off, but we see it as near. On the day when the sky will be like molten brass and the mountains will be like tufts of wool, and no close friend will ask after his friend, though they shall be made to see one another. The guilty one will desire to ransom himself from the torment of that day, even by giving up his children and his wife and his brother and his nearest kin who sheltered him, and all that is on earth, if only that might save him. But no. It shall be a blazing flame, stripping away the skin of the head and limbs, calling to him who turned his back and fled from truth, and hoarded wealth and withheld it. The reality of the hereafter was one of the most difficult truths for the polytheists of Arabia to grasp. They met it with profound psychological resistance, receiving it with utmost astonishment and incredulity. They denied it vehemently, challenging the messenger, peace be upon him, in various ways, asking him to bring about this promised day, or to tell them when it would come. In a narration from Ibn Abbas, it is said that the one who questioned the punishment was Al-Nadr ibn al-Harith. In another report from him, it is mentioned that this was the question of the disbelievers about God's punishment, which is bound to befall them. In any case, the surah recounts that there was a questioner who inquired about the occurrence of the punishment and hastened its arrival. The surah affirms that this punishment is indeed inevitable, for it is decreed by God on the one hand and near in its occurrence on the other. No one can repel or prevent it. Thus the question itself and the haste for its arrival, while it is bound to happen and cannot be averted, reveals the wretchedness of the one hastening it, whether it be an individual or a group. This punishment is for the disbelievers in general, and thus it includes those who asked for it hastily, as well as every disbeliever. It is a reality that will come from God, the sustainer of the ascending steps. This expression signifies loftiness and exaltation, as mentioned in another surah, exalted in rank, the sustainer of the throne. After this opening, which definitively establishes the occurrence of the punishment, those deserving of it, and the source from which it comes, an exalted and lofty source, making his decree supreme, unchallengeable and unstoppable, the surah proceeds to describe the day on which this punishment will take place, the day they hasten, though it is near to them. But God's reckoning is not like that of humans, and his measures are not like theirs. The angels and the Spirit ascend to him in a day whose span is 50,000 years. So bear with patience, a beautiful patience. They see it far off, but we see it near. It is most likely that the day referred to here is the day of judgment, for the context clearly points to this meaning. On this day, the angels and the Spirit ascend to God. The Spirit most likely is Gabriel, peace be upon him, who is referred to by this name in other places as well. He's mentioned separately from the angels due to his special status. The ascension of the angels and the Spirit on this day is singled out for mention, suggesting the importance and uniqueness of this event. They ascend to carry out the tasks of that great day. We do not know, nor are we required to know, the nature of these tasks, how the angels ascend or to where they ascend. These are details of the unseen that do not add to the wisdom of the text, and we have no means to grasp them, nor evidence to support them. It is sufficient for us to sense through this scene the gravity of that day, a day in which even the angels and the spirit are engaged in movements related to the tasks of that momentous day. As for whose span is 50,000 years, it may be a metaphor for the length of that day, as is familiar in Arabic expression. Or it could be a specific reality, where the duration of that day is indeed 50,000 years by human reckoning, though it is but one day. The ability to conceive of such a reality is now much closer to our understanding. For our earthly day is a measure derived from the Earth's rotation in 24 hours. There are stars whose rotation takes thousands of our days. This does not necessarily mean that these 50,000 years are meant to be understood in this way, but we mention this fact to help the mind grasp the concept of varying measures between one day and another. If one of God's days is equivalent to 50,000 years, then the punishment of the day of judgment may seem distant to them, yet it is near to God. Thus, God calls his prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, to bear with patience, a beautiful patience, in response to their haste and denial of that near punishment. So bear with patience, a beautiful patience. They see it far off, but we see it near. The call to patience and the guidance towards it accompanied every prophetic mission and was repeated for every messenger and believer who followed the messengers. It is necessary due to the heavy burden and the arduous path to keep souls steady, content and connected to the distant goal, always looking towards the far horizon. Beautiful patience is that serene patience which is free from discontent, anxiety and doubt about the truth of the promise. It is the patience of one who is certain of the outcome, content with God's decree, aware of his wisdom behind the test and connected to God, counting everything that befalls them as part of what they endure for his sake. This kind of patience is most fitting for the one bearing the divine message, for it is God's message and a call to God. The messenger has no personal stake in it and no ulterior motive behind it. Hence, whatever he encounters in this mission is for God's sake, and whatever happens in this regard is by God's will. Therefore, beautiful patience arises naturally from this truth and from deep awareness of it in the innermost consciousness. God, who owns the message that the deniers oppose and the promise they hasten and deny, is the one who determines the events and their timing as he wills, according to his wisdom and his management of the entire universe. But human beings do not comprehend this management or this decree. They hasten things. If the time grows long, they grow suspicious. Even those carrying the message may feel a longing and a desire for the fulfillment of the promise and the occurrence of what has been foretold. At such times, this kind of reassurance and guidance comes from God, the All-Knowing. So bear with patience, a beautiful patience. The address here is to the messenger, peace and blessings be upon him, to strengthen his heart against the hardship of opposition and denial, and to affirm the other truth, which is that God's decree over affairs is not like human reckoning, and his absolute measures are unlike their limited ones. They see it far off, but we see it near. Then the surah draws scenes of the day on which this inevitable punishment will come, which they see as distant, yet God sees as near. It depicts these scenes in the realms of the universe and the depths of the human soul. These scenes suggest a terrifying, earth-shattering horror both in the cosmos and within the soul. On the day when the sky will be like molten brass, and the mountains will be like tufts of wool. Molten brass is the dregs of melted metal, murky like the residue of oil. The tufts of wool are like loose, scattered wool. The Qur'an repeatedly mentions that great cosmic events will occur on that day, altering the states of celestial bodies, their properties and their relations. Among these events is that the sky will be like molten, murky metal. These verses are worthy of contemplation by those engaged in natural and astronomical sciences. It is likely, according to them, that celestial bodies are composed of metals that are heated to a gaseous state, a stage far beyond melting and liquidity. Perhaps on the day of judgment, these stars will extinguish, as mentioned in When the Stars Fall, losing their light, and they will cool until they become liquid metals. Thus their current gaseous nature will change. In any case, this is merely a possibility that researchers in these sciences may reflect upon. As for us, we stand before this verse, contemplating the awe-inspiring scene in which the sky becomes like molten murky metal and the mountains like weak scattered wool. We contemplate the immense horror conveyed by this scene, which the Qur'an expresses in the most profound way. And no close friend will ask after his friend. They will be made to see one another. The guilty one will wish to ransom himself from the punishment of that day by offering his children, his wife and his brother, and his nearest kin who sheltered him, and all that is on earth, if only that might save him. People will be preoccupied with their own overwhelming concerns, leaving no room for anyone to turn to another. No one will have a moment in their awareness for anyone else. And no close friend will ask after his friend. The terrifying horror will have severed all ties and confined each soul to its own concern, not allowing it to extend beyond that. Though they will see one another, they will be made to see one another, as if deliberately and intentionally. Yet each will be consumed by their own plight, and each soul will be absorbed in its own anguish. No friend will even think to inquire about the condition of another, nor ask for their help. The terror will engulf everyone, and the horror will overshadow them all. What of the guilty one? The terror will seize his senses, and the fear will overwhelm him, so much so that he will wish to ransom himself from the punishment of that day with the most beloved people to him, those he would have once sacrificed himself for in life, defending and living for them, his children, his wife, his brother, and his nearest kin who sheltered and protected him. Indeed, the intensity of his desperation for salvation will cause him to lose all sense of others, wishing to ransom himself with all the people on earth, if that could save him. This is a depiction of overpowering panic, overwhelming horror, and an insatiable desire to escape. A depiction filled with terror, immersed in anguish, and adorned with dread, as it is drawn through the expressive Quranic language. While the guilty one is in this state, wishing for the impossible, to ransom himself with his children, his wife, his brother, his kin, and all those on earth, he hears that which dashes any hope and crushes any glimmer of optimism or self-delusion. As does the entire assembly, they hear the truth of the situation and the reality of what is unfolding. No, it is a blazing fire, stripping away the skin of the head and limbs, calling those who turned their backs and fled, and amassed wealth and hoarded it. It is a scene that makes the soul fly apart, after the terror of the situation has already overwhelmed it. No! This is a rejection of those impossible hopes of ransoming with children, spouses, brothers, kin, and all the people of the earth. No, it is a blazing fire, a fire that blazes and flares up, stripping away the skin of the head and limbs, peeling the skin from faces and heads, a terrifying spectre that partakes in the horror and punishment with intent and purpose, calling those who turned their backs and fled, calling them as they were once called to guidance, but they turned away and fled. But today, when hell calls, they cannot turn away or flee. In the past, they were preoccupied with gathering wealth and storing it in containers. But today, the call comes from hell, and they cannot evade it. Nor can they ransom themselves with all the wealth they hoarded. The emphasis in this surah, and in the surah preceding it as well as in Surah Al-Kalam, on withholding good, failing to urge feeding the needy and amassing wealth in containers, alongside disbelief, denial and disobedience, indicates that the call was facing specific cases in Mecca where greed, avarice and stinginess were rampant, alongside disbelief and denial. This required repeated mention of these matters and repeated warnings about their consequences, as they were among the causes of punishment alongside disbelief and associating others with God. In this surah, there are further indications that affirm this meaning and confirm the features of the Meccan environment that the call was addressing. It was an environment preoccupied with amassing wealth from trade and usury. The leaders of Quraysh were the owners of these businesses, the owners of the caravans in the winter and summer journeys. There was a scramble for wealth, and the stinginess of the rich left the poor deprived and the orphans neglected. Hence the issue was repeatedly addressed and the warnings were repeated. The Quran continued to confront this greed and avarice, battling it in the depths of the soul and its pathways, both before and after the conquest. This is evident to anyone who follows the warnings against usury, consuming people's wealth unjustly, devouring the wealth of orphans extravagantly and hastily before they mature, oppressing orphan girls by holding them for unjust marriage out of desire for their wealth, rebuking the beggar and oppressing the orphan. These persistent campaigns reveal much about the environment. Moreover, they serve as enduring directives for addressing the human soul in every environment, the love of wealth, the desire for it, the stinginess of the soul with it, and the desire to hoard it are fierce struggles within human beings, and overcoming them requires ongoing battles and long-term treatment. Now that the depiction of the horror of that day and its punishment has concluded, the Surah turns to depict the reality of human nature in its confrontation with evil and good, in its state of faith and its state of disbelief, and it establishes the fate of the believers just as it established the fate of the criminals. Verily, man is created restless. When evil touches him, full of panic, and when good touches him, withholding from others except for those who pray, those who are constant in their prayers, and those in whose wealth there is a known right for the beggar and the deprived, and those who affirm the truth of the day of judgment, and those who are fearful of the punishment of their sustainer, for indeed the punishment of their sustainer is not something to feel secure from, and those who guard their private parts, except with their spouses or those whom their right hands possess, for then they are free from blame, but whosoever seeks beyond that, such are the transgressors, and those who are faithful to their trusts and covenants, and those who stand firm in their testimonies, and those who guard their prayers. Such will dwell in gardens of honour. The image of man, when his heart is devoid of faith, as drawn by the Qur'an, is a remarkable one, reflecting the truth and precision of its expression, and its complete portrayal of the fundamental traits of this creature, from which only the element of faith can rescue him and elevate him. Faith connects him to a source where he finds the tranquility that keeps him from despair when faced with evil and from stinginess when blessed with good. Verily, man is created restless when evil touches him, full of panic, and when good touches him, withholding from others. It is as if every word is a stroke from a masterful brush, placing a line in the features of this human being. When the 3 short verses with their few words are completed, the picture speaks and comes to life. The human being, with his traits and characteristics, comes alive. Restless and panicked when touched by evil, he agonizes over its sting and despairs at its presence, believing it to be eternal and unrelenting. He imagines that the present moment is everlasting, trapped in the illusion that the current evil will persist indefinitely. Thus, he is consumed by panic, torn apart by fear. This is because he is not anchored to a firm refuge that strengthens his resolve and attaches his hopes and expectations to God. When good touches him, he withholds, thinking that it is due to his own efforts and earnings, so he hoards it for himself. He becomes a prisoner to what he possesses, enslaved by his desire to keep it. This is because he does not recognize the true nature of provision and his role in it, nor does he look forward to something better from his sustainer. He is cut off from him, his heart empty of any awareness of him. He is restless in both situations, restless in confronting evil, and restless in holding on to good. This is a wretched image of man when his heart is devoid of faith. Thus, faith in God appears as a tremendous matter in the life of a human being. It is not merely a word uttered by the tongue or ritual acts of worship performed. It is a state of the soul, a way of life, and a complete perception of values, events, and circumstances. When the heart is devoid of this essential element, it sways and trembles, tossed about by the winds like a feather. It remains in constant anxiety and fear, whether struck by evil and panicked, or blessed with good and withholding. But when the heart is filled with faith, it finds tranquility and well-being, for it is connected to the source of all events and the manager of all affairs. It is reassured by God's decree, aware of his mercy, understanding the wisdom behind his trials, and always looking forward to his relief from hardship and ease after difficulty. It turns to God with its good fortune, knowing that it spends from what God has provided, and that it will be rewarded for what it spends in his cause, both in this world and the hereafter. Thus, faith is a gain in this world, realized before the reward of the hereafter. It is realized through peace, tranquility, steadiness, and stability throughout the journey of life in this world. The attributes of the believers who are exempt from the general trait of human anxiety are elaborated upon here in the text, except for those who pray, those who are constant in their prayers. Prayer, beyond being one of the pillars of Islam and a sign of faith, is the means of connecting with God and drawing from his endless reservoir of grace. It is the ultimate expression of servitude, where the station of sustainership and the station of servitude are manifest in their purest forms. Here, the text emphasizes the attribute of constancy in prayer, those who are constant in their prayers, which conveys an image of stability and continuity. It is a form of prayer uninterrupted by neglect, idleness, or laziness. It signifies an ongoing connection with God, one that does not break. The prophet of God, peace be upon him, would, whenever he engaged in an act of worship, make it a permanent practice, and he would say, "The most beloved deeds to God are those done consistently, even if they are few." This reflects the trait of tranquility, stability, and steadfastness in one's connection with God, as is befitting of the respect due to this sacred connection. It is not something to be taken lightly, to be done or neglected according to one's whims, and those in whose wealth there is a known right for the beggar and the deprived. This refers specifically to zakat, the obligatory alms, and the designated charity that is considered a right in the wealth of the believers. Or perhaps its meaning is broader and encompasses more than this. It implies that they allocate a specific portion of their wealth, feeling that it rightfully belongs to the beggar and the deprived. This is a way to cleanse oneself from greed and rise above the clutches of selfishness. It is also an expression of the sense of duty that the one who has feels towards those who have not in this interdependent and cohesive community. The beggar is the one who asks, and the deprived is the one who doesn't ask, who hides his need and is thus deprived. Or perhaps he is the one who has been struck by calamity and has refrained from asking out of dignity. The sense that the needy and the deprived have a rightful share in one's wealth is a recognition of God's grace on one hand and of the ties of humanity on the other, beyond being a liberation from the grip of greed. At the same time, it is a social guarantee for the solidarity and cooperation of the entire community. This obligation carries deep significance both in the realm of conscience and in the real world. Mentioning it here, beyond being a characteristic of the believing soul, is also part of the therapeutic process for curbing selfishness and greed, as the surah addresses, and those who affirm the truth of the day of judgment. This attribute has a direct connection to the surah's central theme. At the same time, it draws a fundamental line in the character of the believing soul. Belief in the day of judgment is one half of faith, and it has a decisive effect on one's way of life in both feeling and behavior. The scale held by one who believes in the day of judgment is not the same as the scale held by one who denies or doubts it. The believer in the day of judgment measures life, values, deeds, and events according to the scale of the heavens, not the scale of the earth. He calculates with the hereafter in mind not just the fleeting moments of this world. He accepts both good and bad events, knowing they are mere preludes to what is yet to come, and he adds the anticipated results to his weighing of them. On the other hand, the disbeliever in the day of judgment measures everything by what it yields in this short and limited life, and he acts within the bounds of this world and this lifespan. Consequently, his calculations change, and the results of his scales differ. He ends up with flawed conclusions, confined to a limited scope of space and time. He is wretched, pitiful, tormented, and anxious because what happens in this brief chapter of life, on which he focuses all his reflections, calculations, and evaluations, may not be comforting or reassuring. It may not be just or reasonable unless it is viewed as part of a larger whole, which is far greater and longer. Thus, those who do not take the hereafter into account suffer, and they cause suffering to those around them. A high and noble life cannot flourish if its rewards are not evident here on earth. Therefore, belief in the hereafter is one half of the faith upon which the Islamic way of life is built, and those who are in fear of the punishment of their sustainer. Indeed, The punishment of their sustainer is not something to feel secure from. This is a level beyond mere belief in the day of judgment. It is a state of heightened sensitivity, vigilant awareness, and the feeling of inadequacy before God, despite abundant worship. It is the fear that one's heart may falter and thus become deserving of punishment at any moment, and the constant seeking of protection and refuge in God. The prophet of God, peace be upon him, despite his lofty status with God and his knowledge that God had chosen and protected him, was always cautious, always fearful of God's punishment. He was certain that his deeds could not save him, and he would not enter paradise except by God's grace and mercy. He told his companions, "No one will enter paradise because of their deeds." They asked, "Not even you, O messenger of God?" He replied, "Not even me, unless God covers me with his mercy." In the words, "Indeed, the punishment of their sustainer is not something to feel secure from," there is an allusion to the constant awareness and sensitivity that never fades. For the causes of punishment may arise during moments of heedlessness, and then the punishment would befall. God asks nothing of people except this awareness and sensitivity. If they are overcome by their weaknesses while maintaining this alertness, his mercy is vast, his forgiveness is near, and the door of repentance is wide open with no locks upon it. This is the balance Islam strikes between heedlessness and anxiety. Islam is neither of these extremes. The heart connected to God fears and hopes, dreads and yearns, yet it remains assured of God's mercy in all circumstances, and those who guard their chastity, except with their spouses or those whom their right hands possess, for then they are not to be blamed. But whoever seeks beyond that, those are the transgressors. This represents the purity of both the individual and society. Islam seeks to create a community that is pure and clean, yet at the same time it is candid and unambiguous. It is a society in which all vital functions are fulfilled and all natural instincts are satisfied, but without chaos that strips away modesty and without deceit that kills honesty. It is a society built on the foundation of a legitimate, well-established family and on clear, openly recognized homes. It is a society where every child knows who his father is and does not feel ashamed of his birth, not because modesty has been stripped from faces and souls, but because sexual relations are based on a clean, honest foundation. One that is long-lasting and clearly directed toward fulfilling a human and social duty, not merely satisfying a base animal urge or sexual desire. Thus, the Qur'an mentions among the attributes of the believers, "And those who guard their chastity, except with their spouses or those whom their right hands possess, for then they are not to be blamed. But whoever seeks beyond that, those are the transgressors." It affirms the purity of relations with one's spouse and with those whom one's right hand possesses, concubines, when they exist under legitimate circumstances. The only legitimate circumstance recognized by Islam is captivity in warfare for the sake of God, and this is the only kind of war approved by Islam. The original ruling on this is mentioned in the verse from Surah Muhammad, "When you meet the disbelievers in battle, strike their necks until, when you have thoroughly subdued them, bind them firmly. Then either release them graciously or by ransom until the war lays down its burdens." However, some captives may remain without being released or ransomed due to real-world circumstances. In such cases, they remain as slaves if the other side enslaves Muslim prisoners in any form, even if they call it by another name. Islam permits the master of such a concubine to have relations with her, and it introduces numerous means by which Islam gradually eliminates this source of slavery. Islam, with its clear and honest principles, does not leave these captive women to the chaos of filthy sexual exploitation as happened to female captives in the wars of old and even in modern times. Nor does it pretend, using deceptive language, to call them free while they are, in fact, still slaves. But whoever seeks beyond that, those are the transgressors. In this way, Islam closes the door to any form of sexual immorality except for these two clear and honest cases. Islam does not view the natural function of sexuality as inherently dirty, but the dirt lies in the distortion of that function. Islam is clean, honest, and upright, and those who are faithful to their trusts and their promises, This is one of the moral pillars upon which Islam builds its social system. The safeguarding of trusts and the fulfillment of promises in Islam begins with safeguarding the greatest trust that God presented to the heavens, the earth, and the mountains, but they declined to bear it and were afraid of it while man took it upon himself. This is the trust of faith and the commitment to it by choice, not compulsion. From the safeguarding of this trust and the covenant made while humanity was still in the loins of their ancestors, when God took from them their primordial covenant that He is their one and only sustainer, springs the safeguarding of all other trusts and promises in the dealings of this world. Islam has stressed the importance of trust and promise, repeating and emphasizing it in order to establish society on firm foundations of morality, trust and security. Islam has made trustworthiness and promise-keeping defining traits of the believing soul, just as it has made betrayal and promise-breaking defining traits of the hypocritical and disbelieving soul. This is mentioned repeatedly in both the Qur'an and the Sunnah, leaving no doubt about the immense importance of this matter in the worldview of Islam, and those who stand firm in their testimonies. God has linked the fulfillment of testimony to many rights, and even to the very limits of God, which are enforced through the upholding of testimony. Therefore, God has emphasized the importance of standing firm in testimony, not withholding it when called upon, and not concealing it during legal proceedings. Upholding testimony means delivering it truthfully, without bias or distortion. God has made it clear that testimony is to be given for His sake, saying, "And establish the testimony for God." Here He has made it one of the defining traits of the believers, highlighting its significance as a form of trust, which He singles out for mention in order to emphasize its importance. Just as the description of the believers began with prayer, it concludes with prayer as well, and those who guard their prayers. This is a different attribute from the constancy mentioned at the beginning of these characteristics. It refers to safeguarding the prayer in its appointed times, observing its obligations, its recommended practices, its form, and the spirit with which it is performed. They do not neglect it out of laziness or carelessness, nor do they fail to perform it properly. The mention of prayer at both the beginning and the end of this passage suggests a sense of solemnity and importance, and with this, the attributes of the believers are completed. At this point, the fate of this group of people is decreed, just as the fate of the other group was previously decreed. They will be honored in gardens. This brief statement combines both a form of physical delight and a form of spiritual honor. They are in gardens and they receive honor within these gardens. Thus, they experience both the pleasure of the garden's delights and the dignity of being honored as a reward for their noble character, which distinguishes the believers. The text then shifts to a scene from the early days of the Prophet's mission in Mecca, depicting the disbelievers hastening to the place where the Prophet, peace be upon him, would recite the Qur'an. They would then disperse around him in groups. The text expresses amazement at their hurried pace and gathering, though it was not out of any desire to be guided by what they heard. So what is the matter with those who disbelieve that they hasten towards you, from the right and from the left, in groups? The word hasten, emshtwin, connotes those who rush forward, stretching out their necks like animals being led. Groups, zin, is the plural of zg, meaning a group or faction. The expression conveys a subtle mockery of their suspicious movements, portraying their mannerisms and the form in which they gather. There is amazement at their condition. They do not hasten towards the Prophet to listen and be guided, but rather to glance at him in astonishment and then disperse into groups, whispering schemes to counter what they hear. What is the matter with them? Does every one of them hope to enter the Garden of Delight? Do they, in their current state, believe that they deserve to enter the Garden of Delight when their behavior leads them to the flames, the abode of the criminals? Do they imagine themselves to be of great worth in the sight of God, such that they can disbelieve, harm the Prophet, listen to the Qur'an, and then conspire against it, and still enter paradise because they hold some special status with God? Never, comes the emphatic response, both as a rebuke and as a dismissal of such delusions. We created them from that which they know. They know very well from what they were created, from that humble fluid. The eloquent Quranic expression touches them with this subtle yet profound reminder, gently but deeply erasing their pride and arrogance without a single harsh word. This passing reference paints a vivid picture of their insignificance, their lowly origin, and their worthlessness, humbling their arrogance completely. How could they hope to enter the garden of delight while persisting in disbelief and wrongdoing when they know their own origins? They are too insignificant in God's sight to claim any special favour from him, nor will his laws of just recompense be broken for them, whether it be the flames of hell or the bliss of paradise. As the text continues to diminish their self-importance and deflate their arrogance, it affirms that God is fully capable of creating better than them, and they cannot escape him or evade the punishment they deserve. So I swear by the sustainer of all points of sunrise and sunset that we are fully capable of replacing them with better than them, and we will never be outstripped. There is no need for an oath, but the mention of the points of sunrise and sunset evokes the grandeur of the Creator. The reference to the points of sunrise and sunset could signify the rising and setting of countless stars throughout the vast universe, or it could refer to the sunrises and sunsets that occur continuously over the expanse of the Earth. They occur at every moment as the Earth rotates on its axis before the Sun. Whether the meaning refers to cosmic sunrises or earthly ones, it evokes a sense of the immense scale of existence and the greatness of the Creator of this vast universe. Do the affairs of these creatures, who know their lowly origin, require an oath by the sustainer of all points of sunrise and sunset to affirm that he is capable of creating better than them, and that they cannot escape him, nor prevent him, nor flee from their inevitable fate? At this point, as the text has depicted the horrors of the punishment on that fateful day and the honour of the blissful reward for the believers, it turns to address the prophet, peace be upon him, instructing him to leave them to their fate on that day when the punishment will come, and it paints a picture of their pitiful and humiliated state. So leave them to plunge and play until they meet their day, which they are promised. The day when they will emerge from their graves in haste, as if racing to a goal, with their eyes humbled, overwhelmed by humiliation. That is the day which they were promised. In this address, there is a dismissal of their importance and a warning of impending punishment, stirring fear and anticipation. The image of their condition, their appearance and their movement on that day evokes terror and apprehension. There is also an element of mockery and ridicule that suits their arrogance and their delusion of self-importance. These are the people who, emerging from their graves, will hurry as if racing towards an idol they used to worship. The mockery here is in perfect harmony with their behaviour in this world. They used to rush to their idols on festival days and gather around them. Now they rush again, but what a difference there is between one day and the other. Then the final detail of their wretchedness is given, with their eyes humbled, overwhelmed by humiliation. Through these words we glimpse their full appearance, and their features are clearly drawn. They are humbled, disgraced, and overwhelmed by the weight of their humiliation. They used to plunge and play, but today they are humiliated and oppressed. That is the day which they were promised. They used to doubt it, deny it, and hasten its arrival. Thus the beginning of the surah and its end are perfectly aligned, completing this phase of the long process of addressing the issue of resurrection and recompense. This round of the ongoing battle between the pagan worldview and the Islamic worldview of life now draws to a close.